Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be back here at MacGill, and certainly this morning it's even more pleasurable to hear about all our problems and how we might get out of them. A world run with no economists mightn't work very well, but a world run by economists would be a pretty sad place. And I think the great thing about MacGill is that it is the diversity that is here that I find so stimulating. We've been here before, and possibly Joe should dust off some of the talks from the 1980s. In the 1980s, we had huge government deficits, we had worse unemployment than we face today, we had serious emigration, and we had no hope. We also had a huge balance payments deficit. And it's that lack of hope. I still remember Gay Byrne on his 10 a.m. radio show saying to young people when they were saying, "Oh, what can I do?" and saying, "There's no hope, you might as well emigrate." How depressing I found that. And I suppose, looking back, at the time I did feel that there was hope, and today I do feel that there is hope. I think that we will eventually come out of this, but we've got a lot of work to do. Compared to the 1980s, there are some things that are worse. For example, the financial crisis we didn't have then, and that is a huge burden which we are going to have to carry for the rest of our lives, probably. And it's going to make getting out of this mess more difficult. One of the things, though, which is different is that in the 1980s, we as a people were borrowing like mad abroad, not just the government, but the private sector. There was a huge balance payments deficit, and that made getting out of the mess much more difficult. This year, the people of Ireland will be repaying their debts abroad. While the government will repay a huge amount, the household sector, the households, we're scared stiff whether we lose our job. We are not spending, we are saving, we are repaying our debts. And similarly in the company sector, maybe because they can't get the money, they are not investing, they are saving out their profits as well. And the banking system will be repaying, we put the money in the banks will be repaying the debt. That makes Ireland, you can't be broke if you're repaying your debts. You have a solvency problem. And I think that this is something which we in Ireland, and particular people outside, don't realise. We are ahead of the posse on this one. So we do need some benefits given the problems we have to deal with in the financial sector. And finally, as my colleagues indicated last week, competitiveness is improving. Ed talked about our serious competitiveness problems, as did Eddie as well, and my father talked about it last night. But we are as a society addressing this in terms of labour costs, in terms of rent, in terms of price of services. Everything is coming down, and we are beginning to see the benefits in terms of rising exports in the first quarter of this year. We also, of course, have the infrastructure which we built at much too high a cost over the last decade, but it's there. We have something to build on. We have huge problems, but I don't lack hope for the future. And what I want to talk about is a few steps to recovery, about how we get out of this mess, a few things that we can do. First of all, in fiscal policy, the imperative in correcting the imbalance in the government sector is something which we, myself, my colleagues in the Court of Economic Commentary, have written about constantly over the last 2 years. And the government has planned £7.5 billion of further cuts or tax increases between now and 2014, and we feel that this is the minimum. And if this is done under reasonable circumstances, we will come out of this mess. That means that £3 billion minimum in cuts or tax increases are needed this year. Now, some people have suggested that maybe we could do with doing less, but we must wake up to the reality that it's not that the EU is telling us, although the EU is telling us to do it, but they're rather nice policemen or policewomen. We are in a world which is now run by the bond market vigilantes. Once you release the bond market vigilantes, you can't put them back in the bottle. They're not policemen. They don't play by the rules. They're nasty. They beat you up, possibly unfairly, but in the end, they are forcing you to do what you ought to do anyway. Unlike sort of dementors, which may sap your soul, the bond market vigilantes, having beaten us up and forced us to make the adjustment more and more rapidly, will leave us better off than if we'd done nothing. And the idea of this idea that we need EU rules, the EU rules are irrelevant. When the bond market vigilantes are out there to beat you up, they're much nastier than the EU, and you'll behave better much faster. The problem about them was they weren't around when we needed them. And I'll come back to that issue at the end. So this fiscal adjustment, there is no way out of it. And I think one of the things that the system has done better this time than the 1980s, because quite a number of the politicians were around then, is all parties realised it's better doing it faster rather than slower. Now, largely as a result of our own mistakes, in fact, almost totally, I won't say almost totally, but largely as a result of our own mistakes, we have suffered a huge loss. And in the end, our output and income per head, therefore, must be down by 15 to 20% below what it would otherwise have been. And when the crisis hit in 2008, we insulated ourselves, most of us, through huge government borrowing, or the government insulated us on our behalf by borrowing like mad. So we didn't suffer a fall in income. The people who really suffered first and are still suffering are those who lost their jobs. And there are a huge number of people who have lost their jobs. And in terms of who has paid the price of our mistakes, it is firstly those who have lost our jobs. And I think that the issue is, with very tight budgetary situation, how can we deal with the impact of that on Irish society? Because the government doesn't have the resources to do much. Now, research over many years by my colleagues shows that Ireland is one of the most unequal societies in the EU in terms of the distribution of income. And what we have seen in this crisis is a very public fall of a large number of people with huge wealth and, as a result, very high incomes. And we have scant sympathy for them, because we are paying the price. They've suffered, but we're suffering even more as a result of what's happened. So what you've seen is a huge number of people losing their jobs, a small number of exceptionally rich people losing their jobs, and in terms of what the impact is on the distribution income, I'm not quite sure. One of the things my colleagues have shown, the last two budgets have been actually very redistributive. The people who, in terms of taxes and welfare, who have paid most are people on high incomes, and people on the lowest incomes have been substantially insulated. So budgetary policy has tried to do its bit. It may well be, and in terms of the losers, the unemployed are the first group. And the question is what we're going to do about that, or what the market will do and what we, into policy institutions, can do. Second is probably homeowners in their 30s and early 40s. The people who've done well out of the bust are people like me, who are working, still have their jobs and their mortgage paid off, and in particular pensioners. The people who've done really well out of the bust are pensioners, because their incomes have not been cut, while they have paid some increase in taxation depending on the incomes they're on. Their social insurance pensions have not been cut. And there is an issue in terms of equity looking forward in sharing the burden as to what we do. But even if we may be a more equal society, my colleagues, in terms of the research they've done, shown rather than looking at the distribution of income, a much better measure of the problems in Irish society is the number in consistent poverty. And the great thing about the Celtic Tiger was that it did reduce the numbers in consistent poverty because of the fall in unemployment. The thing that I am certain of now is the numbers in consistent poverty will be rocketing because of the rise in numbers unemployed. And I think that is the challenge for us. Now, to a significant extent, the economy, I think, will adjust, and eventually we will see a return to a quite rapid rise in employment, but not for some time. So what can we do about it? We need to deal with public finances. We need to deal with or do something about unemployment. In terms of taxation, we do have to have substantial increase in taxation. We've got to find £7.5 billion from somewhere, and a lot of it is going to be in taxation. But that taxation should be job-friendly, given the problems we have with unemployment. And that is why the Commission on Taxation suggested, and they took this on board, taxes on property, water charges, taxes on carbon. If you need to raise income tax or VAT, then do it by broadening the base rather than increasing the rates. All of these are things which are not popular, but the bond market vigilantes are out there. They're beating us up, and they're going to beat us up more unless we do something. and we have to raise taxes. It is a choice for society. Do we want to go for taxes that would be job-friendly and help deal with the unemployment problem, or do we want to go for taxes which in some ways may be easier but don't? The current approach to expenditure needs to be is a steady across-the-board cut. So there's likely to be a 3% cut in expenditure this year and next year and the year after because of no recruitment. But the problem is, if you say no recruitment, some places lots of people leave and you're down a lot of people. In other places nobody leaves. A lot of the people who leave actually under current circumstances tend to be the people you'd like to actually hold on to. You have a system which is cutting by salami slicing. That it is not an efficient way, and what we need to do is, and the Croke Park deal was a sign that maybe there will be some support for doing it, and listening to Eddie and Ed, we need to reform the public service, and it will involve cutting more in some areas that are not as important to us, to allow us to, for example, keep dealing with the key areas in health or in education which are priorities. And there will be areas in education and health which will need to be cut in order to find resources. But we need an active management of the cut process, not a salami slice approach. One of the things actually I was going to say something about was decentralisation. But given that Ed and Eddie have said it so effectively, I think I'll skip that bit and save time. The one thing I will say is we did a study for the Department of Finance in 2006. And I repriced that study afterwards. I had a record of all the meetings and who attended all the meetings from every government department, and it would have cost 10% more to have done that study with decentralisation because of people moving. But that isn't the cost of decentralisation. It is the cost of a totally dysfunctional system where people can. And I was really struck actually in terms of development aid. I was at a conference in Oxford, sitting beside a very well-known international academic on aid, who was talking about actually how effective the Irish aid programme was and how it was going to be destroyed by the decentralisation to Limerick. Now, this guy wasn't Irish. I had no idea that he knew anything about Ireland, but that he picked on this and saying, this is how you screw up the system. Well, I'm afraid, all right, enough on that. A final issue which, in terms of expenditure cuts, the government are going to raise the pension age from 2014, so I won't be drawing my pension in 2014. I'll have to wait till 2015, as will all those who are 60 and less. I think that this is, given that we're all living longer, I think it's a very important advance. I think there's been very little discussion of it so far, but what needs to be looked at is you need to raise the retirement age as well. You need to allow or encourage people to work. And studies done in Britain show that that could do a significant amount in terms of addressing the debt burden in Ireland, because you simultaneously increase output and you reduce outgoings by such a scheme. And I look at some of the older members of the audience here who certainly have not retired and are still working. So I think that there's a lesson for the future in that. In terms of labour market policies, experience in the 1980s and 1990s showed that poverty traps, when the economy recovers, when there are new jobs, people can get locked out of the system through poverty traps. And one thing which I regret, and it is still possible to do, is to tax child benefit. If you tax child benefit and use some of the revenue to raise the actual level of child benefit, and then cut child dependency payments, it would mean that people who are unemployed with children would not lose some of their child support when they took a job. That's one small measure which would actually save the government, make money for the government, although the rest of the population would have to pay, and would help make it easier to get people back to work. Work by my colleagues has also looked at activation measures. In Denmark, they have generous welfare payments, but after a while, looking for a job, you have to take a job if a job is there. That I think that we need to look at that. Also, we need to look at training and education. The bulk of the people who are going to be the long-term unemployed have very limited skills in terms of our very limited education, many of them, and limited skills are very sector-specific skills. And those skills are not going to be useful. There will be some increase in jobs in the building construction industry, but we're not going to go back to where we were. So providing training and education for a new economy so that we don't end up with a legacy of unemployment, long-term unemployment, that is a real challenge in terms of retargeting our resources. And the people who are unemployed, and my colleague Philip O'Connell has done work on this, on targeting training and education for people who are unemployed, I think that that work is very important. Also, we will probably need to make savings in the educational area, one area where in the past there's evidence that pupil-teacher ratios, which we've cut very substantially, if we raise them a bit in a targeted way, that might not actually significantly impact on children, but it would save resources, to target resources at areas that we need to build up in education and training. A final area is in terms of the educational system, maybe we should favour early childhood education over fourth level education. If people want to pay for fourth level education, that's fine, but they can pay. Children aged 2 don't have that choice to borrow and pay. So I think that there are areas there, and then there's whole areas which Ed and Eddie have talked about in terms of reforming the education system, moving away from rote learning to learning by discovery, which are important. One final issue is we've done, even with the scant resources, we've still wasted them. For example, the car scrappage deal. If the government had announced they were going to have a handbag scrappage scheme for Prada handbags, and that Prada handbags worth €5,000, if handed in good condition, would be scrapped, and you would have an allowance to buy a new one in Brown Thomas, it would have had exactly the same impact on employment, unemployment and this society as the car scrappage scheme. But people would have said, promoted by the Society of Irish Handbag Industry, the City rather than SIMI, it would have been seen to be mad. But we still adopted this mad scheme. We don't rebuild cars in Ireland, we just sell them and drive them. The final issue, it's not something which has been talked about before, is regulatory reform, and it's not a popular area. We have a large number of what I would refer to as network utilities, electricity, gas, water, leaving out the financial sector, telecommunications, rail, buses, airports, waste. All of these are going to require huge investment over the coming decade, which we will pay for. And it's not generally part of the government's investment. The ESB's Air Grids investment programme is not part of it. They're going to need 10 billion. I think you're a bit over-egging it, Ed, on the 26 billion.
From the Minister's website.
Well, in terms of, I don't want to. All right, I'm not. I think you're wrong on what you say on competitiveness. And while some of the things the minister have proposed are daft, a lot of them actually he's done quite a good job on. I actually agree with. But you're distracting me from what I wanted to talk about. And you might actually agree with me if you listened. Regulation of these network industries is hugely important. Why? If you're going to invest 10, 20, 30 billion, people are only going to lend you money so you can undertake all of this investment if they think they're going to get the money back. If you create uncertainty as to whether you'll get the money back, they're going to want an awful lot more. And who will pay? I will pay, you will pay in your electricity bills, in your gas bills, in your subsidies to CIE, in your telecommunications costs. So it's vital that we have a regulatory system that provides a fair and certain playing field for investment, that is not subject to arbitrary political interference. And I'm concerned about two things. One, a paper published by the Department of the Taoiseach in, I think, December on regulatory reform, where they don't advert to this issue at all. It was all about taking control back into the political system, rather than establishing regulators who can establish a level and certain playing field for investment. They have lost the plot in the Department of the Taoiseach on that. The other area is taking arbitrary decisions which upscut investment decisions promoted by public bodies and raise the cost of capital for everybody is not a wise move. So I think that this is an area which I would add to Eddie's list, where we need to look at regulatory reform, and where we know we need an independent, effective financial regulator, and we're working on it. We need a whole range of other areas we need to look at. The final thing I just want to go back to, and both Eddie and Ed talked about, the IMF and the EU, and outsiders can provide us good advice. The problem, there's a very good paper by Jim O'Leary published on the Irish Economy website, which shows that the IMF and the EU were the cheerleaders for the government between 2000 and 2006. The problem was they said Ireland is obeying by the EU rules, therefore Ireland is doing okay. I kept on trying to tell the IMF, whichever warned the government that they're playing with fire, and they didn't. So just because you have outsiders doesn't mean they're not going to be cheerleaders for the wrong policies. That I think what we need is a society which questions and where we listen to questioning by even people who may be considered mavericks, and that it is only in doing that that we will be able to build a more successful economy in the future. Thank you.